Clearwater Conservancy has been conserving and restoring the natural resources of central Pennsylvania since 1980. As a nationally accredited land trust, the organization is dedicated to nurturing a healthy environment and thriving communities through land conservation, water resources stewardship, and environmental outreach. Clearwater Conservancy's staff, board, volunteers, community partners, and donors contribute year-round to make a long-lasting positive impact on our community. Whether you're hiking the Musser Gap Greenway, admiring the Meyer Dairy Farmscape in State College, birding in the Barrens to Bald Eagle Wildlife Corridor, or meandering along the stream banks of Spring Creek during a Centered Outdoors summer adventure, there are many ways to access the benefits of Clearwater Conservancy's future-focused, science-based, and community-minded work. Engage with us at clearwaterconservancy.org or by calling 814-237-0400.
You're watching CNET, Center County's Government and Educational Access Network.
All right, everyone, thank you for coming, especially from our visitors who've traveled through the snow and the mountains to visit us. It's my special excitement to welcome Professor Ronald Arkin to the university. He's going to be presenting his work, Lethal Autonomous Robots in the Right of the Non-Combatant. I first met Ron about 16 years ago, who sent me an email congratulating me on being accepted to Georgia Tech for PhD program. And while there, I got to witness the development of this field in many ways. Ethics were not at the forefront of people's minds, but it has become in a very important area. Ron is a Regents Professor at Georgia Tech. He is currently a visiting fellow at Queensland University of Technology. His areas of research are behavior-based robotics, human-robot interaction, robo ethics, and he has approximately 230 technical publications, 3 books, and your latest book was Governing Lethal Behavior and Autonomous Systems. He's presented all over the world, including to the United Nations, the Red Cross, the Pentagon, and others. And so please, let's thank him for coming and presenting to us.
Thank you very much, Alan. I guess my microphone is working correctly, which is always a good sign. It's a long trip to come here from Australia, and lots of excitement along the way. But it's always good to see old friends and new and young, fresh faces out here as well, too. To be here to discuss some of the important issues of the day. And this happens to be one of them. In robot ethics, there are many, even with the advent of driverless cars and robot companions and a variety of things. But this is my primary concern, and I have been speaking about it since I got engaged in the field of robot ethics a while back. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay. And I guess I can. First thing on the table is I am not an advocate for war. I don't want wars to happen. If you can keep them from happening, for those of you who are pacifists, I would encourage you to try and do that. Wars are one of the worst things that human beings can potentially engage in. So please help try and make that stop if you can. But the problem is there are 2 underlying assumptions for the work that I'm doing, and one of those is that wars will continue. They have been with the human species since all recorded history, and there is a significant evidence that we will unfortunately continue engaging in this kind of activity. My hope is that if and since we are going to be continuing in this particular endeavor, that we can find ways to make war somewhat relatively humane or more precise, or effectively reduce non-combatant casualties and collateral damage. And the real question is, how can we use robotics and artificial intelligence to do that, if you accept the first underlying assumption? And for those of you who don't, I encourage you to try and follow through on that. The real question is, I've been a roboticist for like 35 years now, and so I didn't start thinking about the ethical questions until, maybe 15 years ago. And there are a whole bunch of different reasons. The first one is we actually started seeing that we were having success in our field and that these systems were leaving our laboratories and going out into the real world and making a difference, having impact in society, changing people's lives in some ways that might be unexpected. And I had a couple of choices. One is I could stick my head in the sand and continue doing what I was doing, or I could, what I like to think, is step up and take responsibility for the creation of the artifacts that we as a community were creating and helping others and teaching others to create as well. I think I took the latter course and tried to be proactive in two ways. One is informing our colleagues as well too about the ethical consequences of their research, to, just as I often say, get their heads up off of the bench to look around and say, oh, we're making a difference in certain ways here. And second, to recognize that this is not a question just for roboticists to engage in, that there is a much broader community which includes philosophers and ethicists and sociologists and psychologists and theologians and politicians and the public at large. How can we deal with this new technology? And there are certain areas in particular which I felt were more important than others, and these are debatable points, but I gravitated to the military one first, probably because I was accepting funding, and still do, unclassified research from the US Department of Defense for decades. In the United States, as you may or may not know, the primary source of research funding for robotics, unclassified research as well, is the Department of Defense. And you have to recognize that this investment is coming for a reason. It's not just pure science like National Science Foundation funding goes, but there is a strategic interest in that. And there are good reasons why it should be invested in as well too. And I had the honor of going to the first Robot and Ethics Symposium. I was invited to that in January 2004. And I didn't know a whole lot about ethics at that point in time. The Pugwash folks were there. They're the ones of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto who were concerned with the proliferation of nuclear weapons after their creation. The Geneva Convention representatives were there as well too, talking about one of the things that still struck me and reminds me to this day is the right caliber of a bullet to kill people with in warfare. There are good calibers and there are illegal calibers, and you might not be aware of that fact. You need to use slow, fat bullets as opposed to small, high-velocity bullets. It has to do with the size of the exit wound which occurs. A small, high-velocity bullet blows out a significant portion of your body as it exits, and it deals with the potential for recovery. It's an aspect of just war theory which is called humanity, which is recognized in those sorts of things. And it struck me as odd that we were talking about these kinds of things. Why are we talking about the size of bullets that it's the appropriate one to kill people with? Well, anyway, that was just one of the aspects. And there was a representative from the Vatican as well too, a priest named Jose Galvan, who was there, not officially from the Vatican, but talking about the appropriate use of technology, robotics technology, which is to enhance the human condition as opposed to replace the human condition. And all these things got me thinking. They got me concerned even more than I was already concerned about this as well too. And what's going on with this community? How are we creating and why are we creating this stuff in the first place? And are we making a better world or are we making a worse world? And if it could lead to a better world, what can we do about that? And so that's why I started getting involved. I had involved for a long time with the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society. We started up with a couple of my colleagues, one from Europe and one from Japan, a technical committee in robot ethics or Robo Ethics. I've been co-chairing the Human Rights and Ethics Committee there for some time. I'm also now involved, some of you may have heard about, hopefully, the IEEE Global Initiative on ethical considerations for autonomous and intelligent systems. A major effort that's going on with hundreds of scientists and other folks from many other disciplines trying to come up with guidelines and policies for the government to adhere not just to military but to all sorts of different aspects. And I got elected to the Board of Governors of the IEEE Social Implications of Technology Society. But also significantly, I remember attending a Navy workshop. It was a small workshop. We were talking about, okay, what should we do next? What's the kind of things for direction? Again, unclassified stuff. But I was sitting in the back of the room, but someone behind me I heard some machine gun fire coming off of the computer. And as a good professor, I said, would you share that with the class? Or would you share that with us? And he did. And what it ended up being was what's called a brag video or a war porn video coming back from the field showing an engagement, which I'll talk about later in here to share a particular scenario that comes up, which caused revulsion in some of my academic colleagues, but begged the question in my mind as to, well, if we had a robot doing that, what should a robot do under these circumstances? So more on that later, so I'll defer that as well. You can find that video under some various different versions in names on YouTube, but I never show it because it's rather gruesome. Anyway, why is the military interested in these kinds of systems? There are many advantages for the military to consider this multi-billion-dollar investment in robotics technology. One is, most of you would probably, and now this applies to women as well too, not like to be drafted and be forced to serve in the military. If we could maintain an all-volunteer force and have fewer soldiers do more and using robotics technology, that's something that many people would like. So this leverage, this multiplication factor is an important aspect. The ability to fight over larger areas. In Australia and in the US, there are major coastlines, and the question is, how do you protect these very, very large areas for extended periods of time? Robotics technology can play a role for that. For the individual warfighter, if you're the guy on the ground that has to go around that corner to see what's happening, wouldn't it be nice to have a robot with sensors to be able to go around there and tell you before you had to stick your head out, in this case? Or if you even had weapons on that particular platform, you could not only see, but you could engage those targets under those circumstances. All of these factors lead to a reduction in what we'll call friendly casualties, the guys on our side doing better and surviving more, which is important, obviously, to the military. And I only do unclassified research, but I also am a firm believer that we should provide the best technology we have available for our young men and women that throw themselves into harm's way in the battlefield as well, too. To me, that's important to be able to do as a nation. And I suspect other nations kind of feel the same as well, too. But at this point in time, no one was really paying attention to ethical infractions from the technological perspective in the battle space. And I don't know if enough people are still doing it at this point in time. So I continue to advocate for that. But the proliferation of military robots is everywhere. There's all kinds of different things that are going on in a variety of different ways in many, many different countries. There's so many more, and these are some older ones as well too. The Avenger actually was not fielded for economic reasons. LRASM, the long-range anti-ship missile, which was quite controversial for some time because it's a really smart cruise missile which can react to pop-up threats and detection and change its course dynamically and then pick a target from a set of targets, even if it had a pre-designated one if that's not available. Automatic targeting and engaging without additional human intervention is available. Other platforms have been weaponized, but most to date are still under the authority of a human operator as to when to actually engage that particular weapon system. These are some old examples, but I like to show them because it tends to wake up the audience. Let's see. Especially this last one, which is from an old one from Carnegie Mellon as well. But the point is, weaponized platforms have been around for a long time. There's all kinds of different things that are used and different missions that are considered, most of which are still under some form of human operation. But if you want to buy your own, you can. They're available on the internet. This one from a company in Korea features autonomous detection and manual autonomous firing with safety. I don't think you would get export permission to bring that into your country, into this country as well too, but you know, if you're the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia and you want a nice robot, there's one you can get. Interchangeable weapons, combat robot lethal, interchangeable sensor packages, a whole bunch of different things as well too. There's a market for these things. Israelis are selling Harpy missiles and other things as well too. So you don't have to develop them. You could just go out and buy them if you're a nation state. And many, many nations are doing that as well too. And as these become more autonomous, and we'll talk about the term autonomy in a little bit, you will find that the temptation to get involved in this aspect becomes greater and greater as well. Now, I still remember the days the military says they will never be autonomous lethal. They'll never use their own weapons and the like as well too. And if you're a naive researcher, you might actually believe that at some point. But unfortunately, I was skeptical at the time, and perhaps my skepticism has been justified. The notion is that these autonomous weapon research is continuing. Whether they are ultimately deployed, whether they are ultimately used, is an interesting question and potentially subject to regulations or bans. We'll talk a little bit about that in the near term. But this particular older report it's an integrated roadmap from the 2009 to 2034 documented the military's investment in future for 35 years in this particular technology. That's a long-term commitment. Who makes a plan 35 years out into the future? It's not going to hold, obviously. It'll have to be continuously revised. But it says we are going this way. And actually, autonomy, and partly indirectly as lethal autonomy, is a pillar of the Department of Defense, one of 8 or 10 or something like that as well too, in terms of strategic investments into the future. Some of these were research, some were otherwise. But the point is, look at that. Roadmap, 35 years. And some of the I used to search this roadmap and come out every year, every 2 years, and I would do a search in the PDF file, anything that started with ethic, to see if and then this one finally hit. It actually came up and it said, so I actually started to think, maybe somebody's listening somewhere about this. And I said, the decision to fire will not likely be fully automated until legal, rules of engagement, and safety concerns have all been thoroughly examined and resolved. Then I started talking about that line, and they deleted it from the next year's version as well. But the point is that indicates they will. It's just once that's done, it doesn't say we won't. It says we will if those criteria are done. The Air Force, of course, not to be outdone by the Army, had a plan for 48 years instead of 35. And they actually stated authorizing a machine to make lethal combat decisions is contingent upon political and military leaders resolving legal and ethical questions, and ethical discussions and policy decisions must take place in the near term, rather than allowing the development to take its own path apart from this critical guidance. And the good news is these discussions are occurring. It doesn't mean they're being fruitful, but they are occurring at the very least. And we'll talk about the progress of these sorts of things. More recent document from the Joint Operating Environment, notice it says 2035 again. They talk about these systems will make autonomous decisions, deliver lethal force, and then they talked about one of the reasons. It says autonomous lethal decision-making capabilities that adversaries are more likely to employ. So this is the first time the rationale came to my consciousness where they said, well, they're going to do it, so we better do it. There was a change in justification, which kind of surprised me when that came about. But it's probably true, independent of that. Whether we should do it's a separate question, but others are investigating this as well too. So as a result of this, a lot of things have been happening within the international community with respect to this. Human Rights Watch. Actually, it was initially the International Committee of Robot Arms Control, which I had the honor of attending their first meeting as an expert. I'm not a member of that group. Generalized to about 30 or 40 different NGOs arguing for a complete ban on autonomous, lethal autonomous systems. They just should not be created whatsoever. The US Department of Defense, around the same time, mandated specific restrictions on certain classes of these systems. I called it not a call for a ban, but a quasi-moratorium, where they said they will not do this for 10 years for these certain types of systems unless, and this unless I thought was really hard to do, of involving high-ranking officials in the Department of Defense, but I found out it might not be that hard to do afterwards as well, too, to be able to deploy those kinds of systems. And the UN has been actively engaged in this through the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapon Systems. As Alan mentioned, I had the honor of speaking as an expert at the first forum of this meeting in Geneva. It's important. But 4 years later, going on the 5th year, although progress has been made in terms of moving it from an informal group of experts to a formal, GGEs as they're called, governmental group of experts, we're still arguing about what does autonomy mean? What does meaningful human control mean? Let me talk about that just a little bit to show why that's so hard to come to grips with. To a philosopher, and I apologize for those of you philosophers in the room because I'm probably inadequately describing this, but I'll do the best that I can. Autonomy, which is technically their word, it comes from philosophy, refers in this context to the ability to have free will or to have moral agency, to be able to act on your own and form an intention on your own to be able to do something. Although there may be some debate from some folks in the room, no robot really has the ability to formulate an intention in the same way a human being can do at this point in time. So by that definition, there are no autonomous robots in existence at this point in time. But roboticists such as myself have been building autonomous robots for the last 30 years. Even my dissertation, it talks about autonomous robots and the like as well too. But that's because it means something different to us. It means delegating a authority for them to undertake a particular task as we instructed it to do. Just like you would tell a soldier to go in and take this building using whatever force is necessary. Or drive this car, take me to, I don't know what the, Main Street. You have a Main Street around here? Okay, so if there's a Main Street around here, safe bet, it can get me to that particular location, without giving it very low-level descriptions of how to carry out that particular task. So we have this disagreement that some of us believe right now autonomous robots exist. Even lethal autonomous robots exist, and I'll talk more about that. And then there's the other community, which has a more future-looking perspective that says they don't exist, and we got to stop them from existing. And until we find out what we're talking about, we're going to be at odds with each other. And then the second term, which is we finally settled on the two terms that hit a nerve. One is autonomy, and the other is meaningful human control. Everyone wants meaningful human control, I would contend. I mean, a robot without meaningful human control is a Terminator, right? I mean, I don't think anyone wants a Terminator. What's the point of that? You just don't want a robot that can go out and decide what it's going to kill and how it's going to kill it and when it's going to kill it, let alone go through time, among other things as well, too. That's not really a good idea, and certainly the military doesn't want that on top of it. But what does meaningful human control? Does that mean that every single time it fires the trigger, pulls the trigger, a human being, or launches a weapon, has to be authorizing that? Or does it mean I can delegate it, as I said, to go into a building using whatever force is necessary and accomplish that particular objective, as you would tell a soldier? This is still debatable as well, too. We don't know at this point in time, but we do want human control over these. We just don't know at what particular level. And so we find a lot of the arguments are cross purposes. We don't know what it is we necessarily want to ban. We don't know exactly what we want to approve. We don't know what we want to regulate. And so there are different gaps in the discussion. And it's important that we try and nail this down. I've often argued that this should be done in the context of specific potential weapon systems that are present. But my concern deals more with non-combatants than military success. We want to avoid atrocities. We want to avoid collateral damage. We want to have as minimal impact on innocent civilians as we possibly can. And this, as I show, is not just US, it's in every war. The difference is you hear about it more, but it's begun since the very beginning. And in certain cases, it was tolerated. You go back in the Bible, genocide was routinely, in the Old Testament, practiced, and it was okay under those cases. Different circumstances now with the advent of just war theory, which dates back to St. Augustine. And I'll talk a little bit about that later from the ethical perspective and how that can relate to the design of intelligent robotic systems. Ideally, should make these things illegal. And in many cases now, with the Geneva Conventions and other things, they are illegal. The question is, can we successfully prosecute those that have conducted this technology, these atrocities, is still very challenging and the like. So it persists even today. And we hear more of it, I suspect, because of the presence of media and instant reporting and the like as well, too. So this is the fundamental problem as well, too, that soldiers, warfighters in general, are both making mistakes unintentionally and killing non-combatants through carelessness in some cases, and in other cases through deliberate acts of atrocities. This, like I say, is to me is a consequence of us being human. And when your life is at stake and bullets are flying, you may make mistakes. You may indeed kill others when you shouldn't. And you should be prosecuted for those kinds of mistakes that you make. But you still will make them. And the governments are concerned with this as well, too, because of these secondary consequences. War crime charges can occur. If you're at home and you're seeing your own troops doing this sort of thing, it may cause reticence towards finishing the war, as you saw in Vietnam and the like. The morale of the troops will decline when you're all started to call baby killers or whatever it is. This is a fundamental problem. And so the driving thing for my research is right up there in big letters. It says the status quo with respect to innocent civilian casualties is utterly and wholly unacceptable. You see these reported every day. The sheer numbers of civilians that are killed in Syria, for example, are just utterly unacceptable, completely and utterly unacceptable. And it's my belief and a driving force in this research that technology can potentially help. One of the aspects I'm looking at is in the use of lethal autonomous weapons of a certain form, but there may be others as well, too. And people aren't studying this problem directly as well, too. It's not a research agenda for most people. Building better weapon systems is. Making sure they comply with international humanitarian law is a requirement. If I say IHL, by the way, that means international humanitarian law, which are the Geneva Conventions and the like as well. So we need to do better. And since we're stupid enough to keep killing each other in the battle space, we need to keep those out of harm's way that are not at fault for this particular engagement. I believe here that this technology can, in many cases, if designed appropriately, do better than human beings in the battle space. Now, that's a big contention, but I'll give you the basis for why I believe that as we move forward, and I'll also talk about the risks as to what's associated with that when I get to that as well, too. But the place where it has to be located is where the engagements occur. Sure, we need to find better ways to stay out of wars in the first place. But once we're in wars, and that's why there's two components of just war theory, jus ad bellum, which is the requirements for a just war, and jus in bello, which are the requirements for fighting in a just war. Jus in bello is after you're already within the war, and that's when these robots are generally involved. I will state this. I am not supportive of a ban at this time, but I'm not averse to a ban if we can show that these systems cannot help with this particular problem. I do believe that a moratorium is the way to go, that we need to be careful about the introduction of this technology and use it in a highly regulated way in certain areas where it can be proven to assist in the reduction of non-combatant casualties. And if we can't do that, it should not be used, this is my opinion as well, too. So this regulation is important. And this is really important for those of you who are ethicists and the like as well, too. Don't panic, okay? This is not a situation which is out of control yet, but it needs to be one that we're considering. When you start, how many of you have seen the movie Slaughterbots? Have you seen that? Stuart Russell put that together to show at the last UN. Very well done. Future of Life Institute. They had all kinds of Hollywood. It's a great science fiction movie. But the whole goal is to instill fear into the discussion as well. It does it very well. But the real question is, if we want to depict these dystopian futures and make them the basis for our decisions, that's not rational. And ethics is supposed to be rational. It's supposed to be a rational process. We're supposed to reason about this and come to reasonable decisions regarding our futures. So try and understand the issues that are involved and not appeal to pathos, is what I'm saying, is an argumentation style. But again, the second assumption I have made, I told you war is inevitable, the first assumption. Second assumption is that lethal autonomy is inevitable. This is a debatable point as well, too. There's a paper by Noel Sharkey which says lethal autonomy is evitable. It was the title of the paper as well, too. I don't know if that's correct usage or not, but it was an interesting title nonetheless. But why I say it's inevitable? By my definition, it's already here. There are systems that are out there which we have granted this decision-making authority, at least to a roboticist, that already fulfill this criteria. Cruise missiles at some point, which adjust their courses and make their way to a pre-designated location, which may not have a callback capability as well too, are one such instance. The Phalanx System on Aegis-class cruisers is a system which fires against supersonic sea-skimming missiles, which are launched at a destroyer or something far away, but they go so fast, you can't ask a human being or call up a human being, what am I going to do now, Captain? Because by the time you do that, you're blown up, you're out of the water, you're sunk. And that's part of the problem. This tempo of the warfare forces this decision-making upon us to become more and more autonomous. And that makes the decision-making move more and more towards the tip of the spear, so to speak, where it's taken away from the human because we can't think fast enough and rationally fast enough under these particular decisions. In certain cases, we can. But in certain cases, we can't. So Patriot missile, any fire and forget systems. You might have remembered, it was the movie The Hunt for Red October, if you ever saw that movie as well too, which was a loitering torpedo. They don't have, communications from undersea is incredibly slow. So no one, you'll fire it out there and it's looking for a particular target signature. It finds that target signature and engages it. There are other kinds of mines that do that as well too. Even landmines, anti-tank mines, which have particular seismic or visual infrared signatures as well too, which they use to engage. They don't call anybody up, they just engage that particular target. Other types of mines, anti-personnel mines, which cannot discriminate and thus violate one of the core principles of international humanitarian law. In other words, if you step on it, it can't tell you whether you're a combatant or a non-combatant. It'll just blow your leg off under those circumstances. We're banned under the Ottawa Accords, which neither China, Russia, or the United States have signed yet to date, although I keep hearing there's discussion about that going to happen. So one aspect is international treaties or prohibition. And if you believe in that, as I do believe in regulation, there is a body which can potentially do that, which now those discussions are moving forward at the UNCCW, but we're kind of stalled until we resolve these issues about what do we mean by autonomous system. And in the meantime, the weapons research is continuing to move forward in the development of these systems. Well, this is the rhetorical question I ask, and so please don't answer it in the question and answer section as well too. But let me explain what I'm saying here. Should soldiers be robots? One of the things that we do in basic training and otherwise is dehumanize human beings. We teach them it's okay to kill each other. We give them the ability to do that. We give them not blind obedience to following an order, but we train them, and I have never served in the military, but I've worked with the military for many, many years. We give them the ability to follow orders as best as they possibly can. And aren't these the kind of traits that you'd like in a robot? Those are the sorts of things that you'd like. And then the next question is, rhetorical, should robots be soldiers? Could they be more compliant with international humanitarian law than humans? Or in other words, as I often say, could they be more humane under these circumstances than humans? Could they, if you define humanity in this case by a reduction in non-combatant casualties, they will still kill human beings and they will still kill innocent human beings, but from a consequentialist perspective, for those of you who are on the ethics side of things, if you get better outcomes in the sense of fewer civilian casualties, to me that's an important goal. But we'll talk about some deontological questions or rights-based questions that come up as well too. One of the most important studies I think our nation has done, and the only nation that has done this to my knowledge, were those that were coming back from Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was the, I think it was, I don't know if it was Desert Storm or Kuwait, I can't recall which. But they did a study of the mental health of the returning soldiers as well as the ethical basis for those soldiers as well too. And then they reported it in the open literature, which is even more incredible. This is a great baseline for our nation, although to me the results are incredibly disturbing in terms of the values here. 45% and 60% of Marines did not agree that they would report a fellow soldier Marine if he had injured or killed an innocent non-combatant. That's the Band of Brothers effect, of course. But the problem is that's a war crime if you do that. They didn't ask him, did you commit a war crime? That would not have been unanswerable. They would not have answered that question accordingly. But 17% of soldiers and Marines agreed or strongly agreed that all non-combatants should be treated as insurgents. They're all the same. You're either with us or you're against us in this particular case. And 17% may seem like a small number, but keep in mind if you have 100,000 troops over there, that's a large population as well. And the things go on and on and on as well too. Many didn't know how to respond. Combat experience was related to an increase if you lost a member, which dealt with the emotional state of the individuals, led to increases in ethical violations. An important study, a crucially important study, a landmark study in my estimation, because this had never been done before, to my knowledge, in anything. There were studies that were informally done after World War II, one of which was a debatable one because it was more anecdotally collected, that showed that, no, this was Vietnam. There was one in World War II as well too, but the one in Vietnam said that 100% of soldiers in heavy combat, I think 33% in medium combat situations and 17% in light combat, and please check those numbers in my book or papers, had either committed or abetted an atrocity. Those numbers are staggering. But that wasn't a scientific study. This was a scientific study. So this is a more credible one. But still, human beings are human beings. And I've often said that the weakest part of this ethical issue is that human beings are the weakest link in the kill chain in this process. This is where the ethical infractions typically occur. And these are some of the reasons for war crimes, revenge, in some cases, pleasure from the power of killing, or killing out of frustration for relatively few. And if you study, I've studied ethology for all my career in robots, which is studying animals in their natural environment. I've worked with IBO and studying pet ownership behavior and canine behavior. I've looked at slugs and praying mantis and frogs, and now I'm looking at sloths and the slow loris, all kinds of animals. And the human being, unfortunately, it's a natural environment in the battlefield. And their behavior in the battlefield is not up to the ethical standards that we prescribe and say are appropriate. And it is a shortcoming. That's not to say that there are not heroes in there that robots will never be. There are soldiers that will far exceed the capability and do absolutely heroic things that are no doubt beyond the capabilities of robots for the indefinite future. But overall, in terms of the levels of mistakes and the deaths that are occasioned in these cases, we need to do something. And I ask this of my colleagues as well too. Don't we have a responsibility to reduce, pardon the gender, but I don't know exactly how to degender this as well too, to reduce humans? That doesn't make it better. Well, I'll say it again, is man's inhumanity to man through the use of technology. And there is no better place to be able to do that because human beings are literally atrocious to each other in the battlefield. And the kinds of things that go on there are, in many states, in many cases, utterly and completely horrific. And the reasons behind it are often because we are human beings. And some of us are frailer than others, and some of us can lift ourselves higher than others. But I believe that we can help studying this as well, too. So let's talk about not killer robots, which is what the NGOs characterize them as, but the next generation of precision-guided munitions. Okay? I'm not going to use the pathos in this case, but I'm going to try and make it a neutral discussion about smarter, more intelligent systems that have the ability to do their targeting potentially more effectively than human beings can. Human Rights Watch argued for the use of precision-guided munitions as a moral imperative when they are in your armamentarium or in your possession if you're bombing in a civilian city. The important is, why should you use those over dumb bombs? You saw Russians using dumb bombs for a while in Syria as well too. You kill more civilians with dumb bombs than you can with a precise bomb. You still kill civilians, but you kill fewer civilians. And I don't know if you're, maybe we have time, we'll talk about the principle of double effect, which talks about why you're not necessarily a criminal if you kill civilians, but I'll save that discussion for later. I mean, the stuff with the ethics of warfare is kind of mind-boggling as well, but nonetheless, it's the laws that we have and the rules that we have. But if we can do it, you have a moral imperative. And I would argue that if we could do the same sort of thing and find weapons system under different types of circumstances, that maybe we can do better with these things. We have a moral imperative for their deployment as well. And the other side is, if you give the system the ability to refuse to fire if it believes it is engaging in an ethical infraction, that's potentially an improvement over just pulling the trigger and not thinking about that. At some level, you could even generalize this into civilian blowback or technology being used. You might have a software safety on your gun as well too. If there's a child and you're trying to pull the trigger, maybe it won't allow you to pull the trigger under those cases if you had those smarts, if we're allowed to possess guns in the future. I don't know what's happening now within that. But in any case, you can make the decision not to fire. The military is not always happy if you're going to give the authority to a weapon to not fire if it's been commanded to fire. That's a different type of engagement. You also can put in human overrides. This was a hard choice at some point in time, because if you put in a human override, that's saying basically an unethical human might still override what the system is refusing to do. So one of the strategies he used, and Alan worked on this as well too, was attributing responsibility and being able to report back these kinds of usage of overrides. If you say, well, you're going to fire even though I don't want to fire, you take responsibility and are set up for an after-action review under those circumstances. And of course, they will use different tactics. These systems can assume far more risk on behalf of a non-combatant if there's uncertainty in a target than a human being ever possibly would in their right mind. Would you walk up to a target or approach a target if you weren't really certain? You might more likely to engage that particular target under these particular circumstances. But a robot is a robot. It's not a sentient entity. It's just a machine that's going out and carrying out its task. Now the risk, of course, is the loss of the hardware, which might be expensive under these cases, but that's a separate question as well too. So you can use different tactics, and that changes the way battles will be waged. Indeed, the use of robotics in the battlefield is being viewed as what's called an RMA, a revolution in military affairs. It is fundamentally going to change the way wars are fought, and that's important to recognize. Aircraft carriers did that, battleships did that, gunpowder did that, the longbow did that as well too. Changes have occurred with the advent of new technology. Even the rifled barrels change from the Napoleonic era to utter destruction not far from here in Gettysburg and the like as well too, due to the advent of the rifled barrel, where people were still marching up in rows. They could actually be hit by these guns right now, but the tactics didn't evolve in time for that. So these are different. So the driver of the research, as I mentioned, the underlying hypothesis, this is a research hypothesis. It hasn't been proven. I'm making no claims that one, this is true, and two, that the way I'm going to suggest that we do it is the best way. There are alternate ways. Maybe you have a better way to be able to do this as well too, but this is more a proof of concept sort of thing that we're dealing with here. But although we may be able to have better outcomes, there still are going to be innocent deaths in the battlefield. That just happens, unfortunately. But they will be unintentional, unless you have a truly malicious programmer in there as well too, which eliminates to some degree the notion of atrocities, which is the intentional killing of non-combatants. But they will still make mistakes. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As you know, every software system makes mistakes. And the question is, can we effectively verify and validate these systems before they go out into the battle space? And how do we test them? There's many questions associated with that. But the objective is to embed the existing ethical codes, just war theory as embodied in the Geneva Conventions and the rules of engagement within these particular systems. Can they change the behavior of those humans that are engaged in warfare? Just merely by observing them, merely being able to report back. If these systems can report back evidence that you are committing a war crime, you might change your behavior under those circumstances, and also potentially lead to reluctance in the adoption of this new technology. All of these things are important, and use existing laws. It will change, I believe, the JAG office, the Judge Advocate General Office, which are the military lawyers who generate the prescriptions for individual battlefield scenarios. What is an acceptable target? What are unacceptable targets? What are the ways in which you should engage the enemy under those circumstances? Well, when we first started this work a long time ago, it's about over a decade now, there was a great article. It was really a good article in The Economist that talked about this, but I love this little picture, which kind of in spirit, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, captured what we were trying to do. Under this Predator, where these guys are crawling underneath it, and they said, where do we plug in the ethics upgrade for these kinds of things? How can we ensure that they potentially comply with a humanitarian law? And although some of my colleagues may say I'm overly optimistic, and maybe they're right in terms of when this can be done, and I don't say this can be done for another 10 or 20 years, even if there is a full-up effort to make that in very narrow circumstances, AI has been making tremendous strides in a variety of different domains. There have been arguments at the time they couldn't tell a tomato from an apple. Well, there's systems marketed by IBM which can not only tell that, but can also the particular type of apple as well too, for a checkout counter and the like. Discrimination and deep learning and the like as well too are adding all kinds of new capabilities. And again, this pushes the field forward faster. Regulation and policy are lagging far behind in almost every area of artificial intelligence. But this one is the one that worries me the most. We need to be able to understand and make sure that we do not push technology out into the battlefield prematurely. Now, I argue for certain conditions that need to be met. My colleagues have talked about the notion of bounded morality and the like. The notion of we don't need to understand all of human moral reasoning to be able to build a moral machine in a particular case. It's impossible, although my colleagues may argue with me this as well too on the next day, that computers can approach the level of human moral reasoning anytime soon. Now, I won't say never, but that's a really complex, hard process to be able to do. But my contention is we don't need to do that in this particular case. We need to find narrow, bounded circumstances. And several missions, such as room clearing operations, or counter-sniper operations, or perimeter protection operations, such as in the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea, are situations which may lend themselves well to these kinds of technologies. I also argue that we should not use them in counterinsurgency, but rather, if they are to be deployed, they should be deployed in high-intensity interstate warfare. That's scary, right? That's, you know who we might be engaged in high-intensity interstate warfare if we're not careful. I know 3 different nations that might fall into that particular category, but we need to be circumspect about protecting civilians. And in any case, we need to minimize the likelihood. And this new engagement that's going on in Afrin or something like that in Syria, they created a corridor, they're telling the civilians to get out, and they're allowing them to escape before conducting the operation. That's technically required by international humanitarian law. You have to give the ability for civilians to escape before you conduct an operation in that particular case. But not all of them go. They never all of them go. Then the question is, how do you protect those that have chosen not to go? And a human presence in the battlefield must always be maintained. The horror of war has to be reported back, and I believe that these systems, as envisioned by the military, are not going to be Terminator like armies crossing over the hills and killing everything in sight. We can do that with bombs and right now if we wanted to do that, but rather will serve to augment human warfighters, maintain the warfighter ethos, which is an important aspect of why people serve in the military, but not replace them entirely. More serve like highly trained specialists alongside, like mules or dogs or something along those lines, to be able to carry out specific operations under specific circumstances. And under those circumstances, do better than human warfighters would. Now, these are the reasons why I believe ethical autonomy can succeed. Okay, I'm doing okay on time. One is, if you give the robot this authority, it can act conservatively. I like to say that it should operate under the principle of first, do no harm. Do not engage a target unless you are certain to a high degree that that is a legitimate target, as opposed to shoot first and ask questions later, which is another strategy that can be deployed. We can deal with creating higher levels of certainty in these sorts of things for ensuring that non-combatants are better protected. These systems will have better sensors. They will be able to see through the fog of war, ultimately, better than human beings can. If we can coordinate and produce those sensors to do that effectively, they, in theory, should have better outcomes. They can be designed without emotions that cloud their judgment. Anger, fear, frustration, the things that cause human warfighters to make mistakes or to deliberately commit atrocities can be eliminated in these systems. We actually use in one of our components of our architecture one emotion. I have patents in robot emotions, by the way, for IBO with Sony and Samsung for other products as well too. But here, guilt, we found a particular use. We took a cognitive model of guilt and used that for understanding when we could cause a robot to stop engaging if the battle damage assessment and the actual battle damage are not in alignment. These are not real guilt. Don't think we're talking about philosophical qualia and true emotions, but they are cognitive models of those phenomena which serve a useful purpose in this particular entity. Other problems such as scenario fulfillment, which have caused errors in humans where you have an opinion, you believe it's going to happen, new evidence comes in saying, that's not going to happen, you still believe it, and so you disregard that evidence because you've made a long-term commitment to the initial decision that you made, which can result in potentially disastrous outcomes in that particular case. The ability to have more sources in an interneted battlefield. If all these soldiers and all these robots and all these sensors and the satellites are sending information all together about what's happening in the battle space from all kinds of different perspectives, I would contend that ultimately computers are going to be able to make better decisions with that in a short amount of time rather than an individual warfighter who is overwhelmed by the sheer amounts of data that are being given. Same reason why fighter pilots often turn off their heads-up display. They're just given too much information and they get cognitive overload. So getting the information is not necessarily the problem. Processing the information is the problem. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we may be able to produce better outcomes among the humans that remain within the battle space as well. So those are the reasons I believe it can have good outcomes. But as you might imagine, not everyone has agreed with me along the way. And this list grew progressively longer the more I talked, which is not a surprise either. There are many different arguments against doing this, and I believe I have good responses to each of those. But some may be better than others from your perspective or may not meet your criteria, which is fine. I'm trying to keep an open mind about this as well too. Some of the reasons, again, responsibility. Who's to blame when civilians are killed? Who's at fault there? And the only paper I ever wrote with a punctuation mark other than a semicolon in the title was "The robot didn't do it, period," as well. There is no way that a human being should hide behind and say, the robot did it, I didn't do it in this case. And the reason I say that is, let's draw analogies with precision-guided munitions. Suppose a bomb is dropped and it lands on a school and it kills all the school children or a church or whatever it is. It kills all those people in that place. Who's at fault? Is it the bomb? You don't say, the bomb did it, I didn't do it. Well, these are no smarter in some ways than that particular bomb. But who could be at fault? It could be someone who lays the target incorrectly or deliberately and put that signature on that thing and said, I want to kill all those people in that school. Or it could be someone who loaded the munition on the plane and deliberately bent the tail fin so that it would misperform under those circumstances. It could be the commander who knew that these systems were not performing up to specifications, yet continued to use them under those circumstances. It could be the manufacturer who didn't design and meet the specifications that were required for this particular product. It could be the designer who came up with the idea for an impossible design that could not meet these appropriate criteria. But it's always a human being. It's not the robot. So the question of how you attribute blame in a war crime is very hard, even when humans are involved, because for humans it requires inspection of intentionality. Let me talk briefly about the principle of double effect and how that plays a role. It dates back to the Middle Ages. And this is what makes killing civilians not a war crime. There is, again, pardon this abbreviated description of it, there is a military good that is attempted to being achieved. And there is an evil associated with that good, which is the occasioning of civilian deaths and the destruction of civilian property. And the military good must exceed the occasioned evil associated with that, as long as it's consistent with proportionality. You're not using more force than is necessary to engage that particular target, as long as you have done effective discrimination in this particular case, and as long as you're not using inhumane means to kill those individuals. If civilians die, but the military good that has been achieved outweighs the civilian casualties, then it is not a war crime. It's unfortunate, but even if it's foreseen, even if you know civilians are going to die, it's not a crime. Again, that's like the bullet thing, right? I mean, the caliber of the bullet. It's hard to get around your head about it as well, too, because some would say it should be a war crime when any civilian is killed. And maybe under United Nations law, which talks about the right to life, that may be true. But under the Geneva Conventions, that is not true. That's the way warfare is conducted. You have to adhere to 4 basic principles, which I'll talk about in a bit. But so that's the principle of double effect. I prefer that these robots would act according to Michael Walzer's principle of double intention, which is stronger than that. The principle, there's still a necessary good, but you must actively strive to minimize the evil that's associated with that, not just tolerate it. And I would like to see robots be able to find ways to be able to do that. There are instances where pilots have refused to go around a particular flight path and at great personal risk went around a different way to potentially minimize the destruction to a school or a church that might have been in the path of a bomb being dropped. That's a way in which they deliberately tried to reduce collateral damage. It's not required, but it's a good thing. In my mind, I like robots to behave that. One of the major arguments we get is the violation of jus ad bellum, which is lowering of the threshold of entry into warfare. That's not necessarily unique to robotic systems. Any technology that creates an asymmetric advantage from one side over the other can potentially make you thumb your nose at the enemy and say, I'm going to go in there, I don't like the way you're looking at me today, and take them out. But again, that is a real problem. That is a real concern. And especially with certain political regimes, it might be more likely than others. But the real question then becomes, what's unique about this particular technology that makes it so special that we have to use it only in this context? For example, consider cyber warfare. There's another case where one may provide a significant asymmetric advantage. Should we ban all cyber warfare? Maybe we should. Should we ban all research in any technology which creates an asymmetric advantage? Should we ban all military research, period? Kind of like freezing the order in the NASCAR, I guess, as well, too, when everyone's, and the yellow flag comes out, or whatever the one is. I'm in the South, but I don't remember I'm not a big fan of NASCAR. So should we freeze that? And you try and talk to nations and say, do you want to stop your military advantage over others? That's less likely to occur. The notion of risk-free warfare being unjust, Walzer said that the jury's out on that, and it's not risk-free anyway. Even if you are sitting in Creech, flying these unmanned vehicles and dropping missiles on people in Pakistan or Yemen or whatever the nation du jour happens to be, those folks are potential legal targets. They can be struck by a legitimate military force. as well as suffering from PTSD and exhaustion and other things as well. So it's not completely risk-free, but it's certainly risk-reduced and risk-asymmetric from one side. Some argue it's just too hard. I don't agree with that. Just because we can't do it now doesn't mean we can't do it ever. And I would contend that in certain narrow circumstances, it's easier than others. And those are the sweet spots that I think might be the best deployment aspects for this technology. The effect on squad cohesion I talked about earlier, the violation of the band of brothers effect, which would make the military reluctant. The notion of science fiction and robots running amok, well, leave that to science fiction. The ability of a robot to refuse an order doesn't necessarily make the robots happy. Thank you. Overrides, winning hearts and minds, cybersecurity, and this one, particularly in the bottom, mission creep is a concern. Mission creep refers to our really smart soldiers who figure out new ways to use weapons than they were initially intended to be used. So they're designed for this operation, but they can be used a slightly different way. The classic example is a robot that Peter Singer in his book Wired for War talks about, which was an IED robot, improvised explosive robot, a PACBot. They put a Claymore mine on it. They drove it around the corner, and they used the arm to detonate the Claymore mine to take out the guy that was around the corner under those cases. It wasn't designed to do that, but there's a long and rich history of people using things in innovative ways. How we do this is representing these core four principles, as I mentioned before. There must be a reason to use force. You must not use force inhumanely. You must use only the right force that is appropriate, and you must be able to tell combatants from non-combatants before you engage a target. There's this long and rich history of the development going back to 1864 of codified laws of war. They are abstract, but they're more concrete than most codes of ethics. That's the interesting thing, is because philosophers have thought about this for a long time, and people have actually codified this better, I would contend, than in any other domain that I'm aware of. So to me, this is the low-hanging fruit for ethical robots. We can design these systems more effectively. There's a whole bunch of laws of war which have these kinds of aspects. These are some of the ones that are relevant. The rules of engagement are designed by lawyers, which are specific. Rules of engagement are classified because you don't want the enemy to know how you're going to fight. These are just a higher level description of some of them as well too. And it talks about what were acceptable targets and how to behave within the battle space. We use a variant of action-based machine ethics, which initially we thought deontic logic, Selmer is a hero in that particular space among others, of using deeper forms of ethical reasoning. We found actually first order predicate logic was sufficient for the kinds of things that we were looking at, but I'm keenly interested in exploring deontic logic more deeply in this space. Ultimately, we developed this work joint with Alan and two of my other graduate students at the past who dealt with a mathematical underpinning for the representations associated with that, translations into a particular robot architecture, and a flow of control for these sorts of things. There's an entire book, as Alan mentioned, on this particular topic, and I'm not going to delve into the technical details associated with that at this point. Others are beginning to operate in this space. We also designed ways to maintain ethical, meaningful human control with the use of overrides. This just shows the two notion of kind of like the big red button on the robot, which says, don't do that. And the other one says, well, I want to do that. And the robot is saying, no, that's a different kind of override under those circumstances. So here are some of the scenarios. Let me go through a few.
We have a story tonight that has to do with a single photograph. It's a surveillance photo taken in Afghanistan and obtained exclusively by NBC News. It's a photo of a gathering of Taliban fighters, but some say it shows more than that. Some say it shows what was a perfect opportunity to take out the enemy, but the military was unable to take the shot. The question is why? It was NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders who obtained this photo exclusively. He reports for us tonight from Kabul.
Brian, it took 5 days for the U.S. military to consider my request to declassify the photograph. It's a grainy still image that shows what some here in Afghanistan say was a lost opportunity to inflict serious damage on the Taliban.
Army intelligence officers say the photo shows 190 members of the Taliban at a funeral 2 months ago. The U.S. Army claims among those in the formation high-ranking members of the Taliban leadership. An unmanned armed predator like this one was spying on the group. Intelligence officers monitoring the scene in real time wanted to fire. They asked permission. The request went to intelligence analysts, senior commanders, and lawyers. But intelligence officers were told no, they were not allowed to fire. Why? U.S. rules of engagement do not permit waging war in a cemetery.
That was frustrating. Those individuals live to fight another day, potentially could cause harm to our soldiers, civilians, the population of government Afghanistan.
Despite frustration, U.S. military leaders here say the decision not to fire was the right one.
Meantime, the Taliban fight by their own rules. On Monday,
Well, whether you agree with that decision or not, that's according to the rules of engagement. And it would be incredibly easy to build a robot to do that without calling up the Pentagon and the lawyers as well too. You just put no kill zones over cemeteries if that was the case. But even if you disagree that that was the right decision under those circumstances, translate to those people standing on the roof of a hospital, okay, or in a mosque praying, not abusing the property, but using it what it's for. Doesn't mean you can't engage them after they leave that location, but that was unacceptable to do it under those circumstances. This is almost immediately implementable in this particular case. Now this one is a tougher one. This is that video I was talking about earlier at the beginning. It deals with 3 people, I'll call them insurgents, that were planting improvised explosive devices at the side of a road. The first one is targeted by an Apache helicopter, which if it's far off, it's quite quiet. You really can't hear it, and especially in the dark. You won't see it as well too. The gunner fires a chain gun, which is mini cannon shells. Those are not pleasant to watch, what it does to the human body, so I don't show that in this particular video. Liquefaction is kind of what happens in that case. The first individual is taken out. Looked like a legitimate target, conducting a military operation. Then the gunner retargets that to the second individual. And the other person is kind of frozen in his tracks. And the second individual is neutralized, to use the military correct phrase for this. Then the third individual, at this point, recognizes something going on. He climbs underneath the truck. The truck is a legitimate target. It's materiel in support of this operation. They can be destroyed. It says, here the discussion goes, want me to take the other truck out? And I don't know if this is from the gunner and the commander in the plane or remotely. It says, Roger, wait for move by the truck. At this point in time, the guy under the truck, the guy fired next to the truck. He was instructed to fire next to the truck. Remember, these are exploding shells. He climbs out from underneath the truck, staggers about 5 meters, and collapses to the ground. At this point, he says, wait for move by the truck. The gunner says, movement, right there, Roger, he's wounded. Without any hesitation, the commander says, hit him. The gunner says, targeting the truck. This one says, hit the truck and him. Go forward of it and hit him. Have any of you seen this, by the way, military personnel? A lot of military folks have seen this. Go forward of it and hit him. He retargets the gun for the wounded man. Weapon discharge occurs, and that individual is neutralized as well. So the real question that came up from this, from my point of view, is would I want the robot to take that shot? Okay, this is someone who's been declared wounded. Being wounded without posing an additional threat means you're what's called hors de combat. It's a status that combatants achieve by virtue of wound or by virtue of surrender, where they are rendered equal to non-combatants at that point in time. They pose no threat. And even if they're going to be recovered by the enemy, you still can't kill them. Imagine if this was transposed and there was a guy on the ground and he walked up to the gun, even though it might be more humane, you might think, because this guy's probably going to die anyway, and you pull the trigger and blow his brains out at that point. That's a summary execution. You can't do that either. You're supposed to render them the same aid that you would render, according to International Geneva Conventions, the same aid that you would for your own troops under those circumstances. Now, you might not agree with that, but that's the principles that we fight under and we adhere to at this point in time. So I asked many JAG lawyers. I presented this to JAG lawyers, roomfuls of JAG lawyers, and I say, would you want my robot to take that shot? And I don't know, maybe I've spoken to 150 JAG lawyers at different times about this. Only one said yes. And I can't tell you who, because of Chatham House rules and the like as well too. But he was a high-ranking individual in the chain of command as well too in terms of JAG lawyers in theater at that point. So I used to say it was a 100% decision they would not want the robot to take that shot. And I had, after that guy voiced his opinion, I had other JAG lawyers come up to me and said, I don't agree with that particular decision as well too. But there you have it. So someone has to make these decisions. Should a robot take that shot or not? And we have to be able to be sensitive to that. Finally, the Dmz robot is one that has been fielded and tested, although rolled back from the Korean border. This is an interesting situation where there is warfare that exists between two states. It's a state of war. It's an armistice, but a state of war exists. There's something in the DMZ called the military demarcation line, which if you cross that, you can be shot. It's as simple as that. You're a legal target under those circumstances. And this particular weapon system was developed to detect targets, I think 5 kilometers out during the day and 2 kilometers at night. The machine gun won't go that far, but the whole point is it was used and tested in this particular area, and maybe it's a legitimate use. If you have a state of war, you have a line that you can cross. If someone crosses it, you can kill it. Maybe that's an appropriate use, especially if an entire army is coming across under these circumstances. Maybe you would want robotic platforms to be able to engage that. So that shows a little dot on that individual's head and the like. So that's another example. There's other scenarios I don't have time to go into now. We did field this in our own system, and we've tested this in the laboratory. We do not have lethal autonomous robots in our laboratory, but we can simulate them. This was a video which was produced for our presentation at the World Science Festival, and it shows, there are other videos as well too, showing how proportionality can be conducted. And you've seen the movie, what was the one with Helen Mirren? Eye in the Sky. You see that movie, Eye in the Sky? Where they did collateral damage assessment before they were releasing a weapon to try and save a child's life in this particular case. Most people say you do proportionality assessment. Lo and behold, they had a program which was really badly named called Bugsplat. Bugsplat is a bad name for computing collateral damage and civilian casualties, so they changed it to CD fast, collateral damage fast computation. So these sorts of things are there. And then you can apply and use restraints and restrictions on this. Different weapons would be done based on prohibitions or obligations as well too, and it goes on and on. There's other videos available on our website, which I will not be showing here. You can find those if you like. But to really do this, there are so many questions that have to be answered that haven't been answered. That's why I argue that people need to expand and understand this research space more and more. These are just a few of the questions that need to be addressed. Other nations, such as Israel, have been concerned with these particular aspects for their pilots. Also, if you start killing civilians on your own, you're not going to feel good about yourself as well too under these cases. So they've been exploring that. And bottom line, if you really just don't like robots killing people, if you find that disgusts you, the entire concept, you still have recourse. You don't have to prove anything. There's something called the Martin's Clause in international humanitarian law. Weapons which violate the dictates of the public conscience may also be prohibited on that basis alone. So if you don't like killer robots, you can try and invoke the Martin's Clause. But the Martin's Clause has never been successfully invoked against anything, and most people don't really know what the dictates of the public conscience are and how you measure that. So some of the debate that's going on is trying to invoke the Martin's Clause in this particular case and using surveys and the like. So as I mentioned, I'm not averse to a ban. We need a moratorium. I believe that we can do better. Regulation is an appropriate aspect. We are using dual use of this in the context of work I'll actually be talking about on Saturday in management of human-human relationships and the ethics and preservation of dignity using the underlying architecture, but I have no time to go in for that as well too. But the bottom line is really the top line. It's unacceptable, the situation as it stands today. We need to do better. It's hard to do, but we need to be proactive about it, and we need to be extremely careful as we move forward, if we choose to move forward. I will not tell you whether you should support a ban or whether you should support a moratorium or whether you feel it should be unregulated. Those are decisions that you have to make for yourself. And I hope you do make those decisions, and I hope you voice those decisions. I think that's crucially important. So if you're interested in more information, these are some of the places to do that. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today.
Time for some questions. If you have some, please come up to these microphones over here. No, let's
There's two
come
of them.
up here.
Yeah.
Did you have a question there? I actually do, yeah. Oh, come on.
I have about 5, but I'll limit it to one. So,
Well, don't ask them all at once, because I
Okay.
won't remember number one. by the
so
time you
and
get to
I'm going to guess, Ron, that you've heard about every question that can come up in this room.
Occasionally people so
Okay.
surprise me.
So I'm wondering, have there been new ethical issues raised by the introduction of the autonomous? In other words, you're saying so much of this is based on, history and ethos and things that we've dealt with for a long time. Are there new elements that we haven't
Right.
thought
The
through?
best way to phrase that question is existing international humanitarian law adequate at this point in time? Because is there something really new or different about that? There are some people that say, yes, there are. This autonomy, if these agents have the ability to formulate their own intentions on their own and people can't control them, in that case, that's different than traditional killing. Others say, maybe it's not really different. As long as we can show that these systems comply with existing international humanitarian law, we don't necessarily have to make any changes. And the other questions are, what is autonomy now in robots? I mean, that's the real deep question here. The authority that we are going to delegate to these systems, both now and in the future, as they move more and more towards formulating their own deeper intentions and having a deeper understanding of ethics as well, too. Where is that break point that we will say, enough is enough? We can allow you to do this, but we can't allow you to do that. And some say, we can't allow you to do anything. I'd like to still know what that thing is that we're banning in this particular case. And others say, we can manage it as we go along. So it's all terminology to some extent as well, too. But the technology, this notion of autonomy and definition of autonomy is changing over time. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Do you want to ask another one?
Yeah, is that okay? I didn't want to. So here's my second one. This is just trying to get my head around this. So you're a state, I'm a state.
Mm-hmm.
You have an army of robots. I have an army of robots.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we go to war? Like, we're just in the end going to lose all of our robots, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking, now this is really crazy, but could we possibly end that kind of war? Perhaps it shifts to other kinds of war, like economic or other kinds of things.
It's like mutually assured deterrence, MAD philosophy as well, too.
Yeah,
It's the same thing. Can we assure that the outcomes would be so horrific that it makes no sense to use those weapons under those circumstances? That's a possibility, but I don't think these weapons are being developed in a way that will, it could be. We hear swarm technologies and other things that are potentially being used, but the notion of removing human beings, to me, I find it sounds horrible to say, I don't think we should remove human beings from the battlefield. To me, it would be abhorrent to not maintain a human presence in the battlefield, because I've had people argue that war is inherently a human endeavor. We must not only have humans, but only humans should be allowed to fight it. But my counter to that is then atrocities are inherently a human endeavor as well. And so how can we find the right balance between the use of technology? And I'm concerned with outcomes. If you could stop war, that would be great. So that would be a wonderful positive outcome. I'm not sure that would be achieved using the paradigm that you described, but who knows? It would be interesting to explore that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ron, for a very stimulating talk. Unfortunately, I agree with 99% of what you said.
That's better than I expected.
The 1%, I think, though, is maybe irreconcilable. So let me express one concern in that 1%. Paradoxical realism is how I would characterize it. I see your work and your presentation as being just indefatigably realistic. you know, war's been with us forever. We were not going to assume we're not going to have war. Don't tell me there are no autonomous systems out there. I already have them, et cetera. But I don't think you're being sufficiently realistic across the board. I think your own attitude of realism implies, for example, to use a concrete event recently out of the news, the Litvinenko apparent assassination. Okay, now presumably that was done by a human being delivering the what's essentially a biological weapon, and the United States is characterizing it that way, as you know, that this is a violation because biological weapons were used.
Chemical, but
chemical.
Yes,
well, you know, but it's chemical
treaties, yes.
inside the body leading to. Okay, so there won't be any lines of the sort that are presupposed by our laws of war and by our rules of engagement. That's clearly, in my opinion, not even worth restricting the discussion to. That's our country. But if we'll always have war and we'll always have adversaries, and autonomous weapons of increasing power will inevitably be used by these adversaries, the blurring of the combatant, non-combatant thing is already done in terrorism, right? So just look at what you gave us. You can buy your own weapons as robots. War is essentially inevitable, not theoretically. There's no mathematical theorem, but going to happen. Asymmetrical conflict is already with us. Isn't this going to a place where we will face adversaries that use autonomous AI of enormous power to carry out, just for starters, assassinations? And if there's genuine autonomy that persists through time, you drop a few of these creatures down and let them go to work in Washington, D.C. over a period of 5-10 years. I mean, isn't this, if we think realistically about where we're going, there's no objection to what you're saying. It's just, in terms of the tech, it's just, you know, that's where the realism ultimately takes us. So then, all right, the plight of the non-combatant, I also specifically reflect that, but I also see an obligation on the part of people such as yourself to build for that future, to be so realistic that we know it's going to happen and our machines had better deliver a kind of defense against this very depressing future. And I was wondering if I could get your reaction to that.
There's several things related to that. One, of course, is the argument that's often made about countermeasures and going back and forth. As systems are built, countermeasures will be done. You're arguing, though, for systems and issues that already exist. I mean, it sounded like you were talking about the CIA in South America, which didn't use these kinds of weapons years ago for targeted assassinations and the like. Our country is not blameless in these sorts of things as well. And you don't need robots to do it. They may facilitate that operation and make it easier to be able to occur. But also, I mean, it's the same thing also with nuclear weapons as well, too. I mean, nuclear weapons can be used out of context. Any kind of weapon system. You could go buy, if the government allowed you could go buy a tank, or you might even, if you're, I don't know if it's lucky, if you're a terrorist, you could find potentially a dirty bomb or other materials to make as well, too. Robotics, to me, is not unique. Are we creating another pathway in the space of pathways? I would contend yes. But the point is, there is at some level recrimination associated with certain acts as well too. And can we manage that? And you're saying a realism is that we can't manage those sorts of things. And I'm saying I hope we can.
Yeah, so a brief follow-up. I think a fully autonomous, highly intelligent, not necessarily super intelligent machine is a kind of weapon we've never seen. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's part of where we part ways. Okay, there are in the intelligence community and its history on all sides there have been, of course, bad things done. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think the ability to carry out assassination as a human being with a rather conventional weapon is going to bear any comparison to what is possible in the future. We should be able to send, for example, an autonomous swarm on a mission where each where each device is that big and can leave from the United States and show up in a foreign country, and not now, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. That doesn't compete with someone being dropped on the coast, even in a group of 2 or 3 humans going into the country to try an assassination. So I think that's where we're going, and we have to engineer with the capability that you are yourself developing against that future, because we'll face those things.
I agree.
So you agree?
I agree that we have to put safety into these systems at all levels. And that is to preclude the use in certain missions, to make sure they're used in the context that they were designed for. That's part of all of the development. I didn't go into the actual space of the development, so I agree with you. And as far as future autonomous systems, which may not be super intelligent, but maybe comparably human intelligent as well too, to me, those don't exist yet. I don't know when they're going to exist, and maybe they should be banned. That's why I encourage the NGOs to try and tell me, give me an example of a system, and maybe this is one as well too. If you construct it in this particular way and say it was going to be used for this particular purpose, maybe I would agree. It should be banned under those cases. We should not be creating systems that are designed to function outside of international humanitarian law. It's actually illegal to do that. That's a violation of international humanitarian law, because every weapon system must comply with that is fielded. But you can't account for what people are going to do outside, non-state actors and others as well too.
And they will do it. Yeah.
There are dangers. I agree with you completely on that. Are they manageable dangers? I honestly don't know. But I'm trying to come up with a way to manage some of the dangers. And if they are, as I said, I'm not averse to a ban. If they are proven to be unmanageable, then we should ban them, as long as we can define what that ban happens to be.
Okay, if there are other questions.
There is one more right behind you.
So
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome.
So thank you very much for an interesting talk. I guess I'm going to take it one step further by asking, if the decision of an entity is to advance ethical robots versus unethical robots, what's the Nash equilibrium for a scenario like that, if you have 2 entities?
Interesting question. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that in that particular language. If the, I was going to rephrase it slightly. Part of the question is, how do we design and field an ethical versus an unethical system and still have the outcomes that we want to get?
I guess I can add, if an ethical robot led to victory versus, no, if an unethical robot led to victory versus an ethical robot, what's to keep an entity from advancing an ethical robot?
International humanitarian law. It's the laws that we've created as a world society that says this is the way we are going to fight. And technically, it's criminal prosecution of the individuals that stray outside those particular laws. If you are creating unethical weapons, robots, or what have you, if you're using nerve gas in Syria, or using it for assassinations, or whatever, you become criminally responsible to a world tribunal where you should be prosecuted for the use of those particular systems. Whether that can be done effectively is a separate story. But any illegal weapon that is deployed that does not comply with the requirements of international humanitarian law, and they have to be certified to comply with that. There's a whole process. Article 36, I think, is the article that's concerned with ensuring that these systems comply with international humanitarian law. That provides the basis for structuring these systems. Now, does that mean that even, suppose we put an ethical system, you could turn it off, right? I mean, if I had an ethical governor and I said, you could turn it off, and folks such as Walzer have argued that, yes, we should be fighting by just war theory, but when there's an existential threat to a nation, in other words, we're all about to be destroyed, our nation is about to be overwhelmed, that's when nations, states start to turn off. It's also in their soldiers, it's not just in the robots as well too, where they will start to use weapon systems and start to use tactics that are normally unacceptable. There are things in World War II, for example, the bombing of Dresden and other, and one can argue Nagasaki as well too, which were fundamental violations of the slaughter of civilians, although recharacterized in interesting ways before the United Nations. Those sorts of things, where the victor was not tried in that particular case. But were they acceptable weapons for the use in that particular way? Many would argue not. So the tension exists between, and the Pentagon has asked me at times, okay, suppose we have ethical robots and we have unethical robots. What's the difference in terms of not just tactics, but will they be able to perform as fast as those? So from a designer, it starts to mean you better make this process lightweight. In other words, if you've got to sit around and hold your head and think about what am I going to do now, you're going to become overwhelmed and the system will never get fielded under those circumstances. So hopefully that helps. I'm sorry I couldn't characterize it in terms of the Nash equilibrium, but I'll be thinking about that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you so much.
You're watching CNET, Center County's Government and Educational Access Network.
Did you know that all CNET programs are available to watch online, on demand at cnet1.org? Meetings of CNET member municipalities including Bellefonte Borough, State College Borough, and College, Ferguson, Half Moon, Harris, and Patton Townships, along with the Bellefonte area and State College area school districts, the Center County Commissioners, and the Center Region Council of Governments are available to watch on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at your convenience. Simply visit cnet1.org and look for the video player in the middle of the screen. On the Playlists tab, you will find a list of programs related to CNET's various member organizations. There are also playlists for candidate interviews, community events, SCLO library programs, Penn State programs, and others. Choose the playlist for the program you wish to watch. For example, to watch a meeting of the Center County Board of Commissioners, click on the Center County Government playlist and look for the date of the meeting you wish to watch. Click on the title of the meeting and the meeting will begin to play. To see the bookmarks for the individual agenda items in the meeting, click on the tab labeled Chapters. You will see individual chapters for each item on the meeting's agenda. Simply click on the agenda item and the video will skip to exactly that point in the meeting. This feature makes it quick and easy to watch only those agenda items of interest to you. To easily share the video with others, hover your mouse over the upper right-hand corner of the video and click on the Share icon. From this screen, you may copy the link to the video, copy the actual embed code for the video, or easily share the video on Facebook or Twitter. Just click to copy. In addition to CNET's on-demand programs, you may also watch Channel 7 and Channel 98 live from cnet1.org. To watch Channel 7, click on the playlist CGTV Live. To watch Channel 98, click on the playlist CETV Live. Please note that some live programs will not be available to view live online using this feature. For more information, please contact us at cnet@cnet1.org. CNET has made it easier than ever to stay informed and connected to your local government, school district, and community. We hope you enjoy watching CNET online at cnet1.org.